is Snapchat standing concerning the GDPR? How do you do the compliance for Europe?
So for Snap, complying with the GDPR was actually a very natural process. Snap's privacy practices have always been very well aligned with the GDPR's principles of data minimization, retention, purpose limitation. Snap has always had a very strong privacy by design program. So when it came time to do GDPR compliance, Snap already had the core GDPR requirements in place. And so everything about GDPR compliance was just about building upon that core and enhancing our privacy practices.
And where did you see the biggest challenges, or what are the biggest challenges of it?
Some of the biggest challenges of GDPR compliance were doing the data inventory, making sure that we understood every single piece of data that we had collected, and then going through the process of making sure that we had a legal basis for the collection and processing of each piece of data. That was a very lengthy exercise, but a very important one, because in order to fulfill the transparency requirement, a company really needs to know all of the data that it's collecting and what it's using it for. And so that was a very long and challenging exercise, but ultimately very important.
So what will change for the users from the 25th of May on?
Mostly none of our privacy practices will change, because again, the core of our privacy practices have always really been in line with the GDPR principles. We've always had very short retention periods for data. We've never collected a lot of data. We've always tried to be very transparent about the data that we're collecting and what we're doing with it. So we actually just launched a new privacy center today that provides even more transparency about our privacy practices. So mostly you're just going to see a couple of new controls that we put in app now that allow users to see advertising categories that we use, and giving the users control over what lifestyle categories and interests to be targeted against, and actually giving users the ability to opt in and out of those lifestyle categories.
And do you see differences between the US and the EU concerning data protection?
So the U.S. approach to privacy and the legal frameworks that control privacy are very different from European data protection framework. We have a sectoral, sort of industry-specific approach, and no real overarching individual privacy law. We have the FTC Privacy Act, which is about the closest we come to that kind of individual privacy law. The GDPR, however, is much more expansive and applies to all individuals in all settings. So we have just different approaches in that respect. The extraterritorial scope of the GDPR has now brought the GDPR to the United States, and many U.S. companies now actually have to comply with the GDPR, which has really created a new framework for privacy within the United States.
And where do you see the biggest achievements as well in the GDPR?
Well, the GDPR is a really remarkable regulation for protecting data. It's the process of becoming GDPR compliant for a company really exposes the depth of its ability to protect data. It's very comprehensive. It requires an enormous amount of work for a company in getting firm control inside its borders about the data that it has and what it's doing with it, and requires such accountability from a company. And with that accountability comes much greater protection for users. Without accountability, there's no data protection. So I think that's the principle of accountability in GDPR is very powerful.
What would your advice be for data protection officers? What shall they do now concerning maybe as well the GDPR?
The data protection officers are going to have really huge jobs now with the GDPR, because it is a very complex law with many different facets to it. There's a lot of moving parts to pay attention to, and from company to company it'll be different what the data protection officer will be called upon to do the most. So I think being able to keep independence and be able to make evaluations on their own will be very important, because there will inevitably be company pressures to orient the data protection officer in a particular direction. But the data protection officer really should have the expertise to be able to make an assessment as to what parts of the GDPR are actually most important to pay attention to. All of them are important, but certain companies are going to require more or less attention on certain aspects of GDPR.
What do you think, could a conference like this maybe help with it, or what's the added value of an event like that?
This event is really meaningful in bringing together a much smaller group of both data protection authorities, professionals with a great deal of experience in data protection, especially this year at a time where many of us have gone through the process of GDPR compliance. Data protection officers data protection authorities rather, are about to have to embark on interpretation and enforcement, and to be able to come together in a smaller environment and have open and honest conversations and debates about some of the finer points of GDPR as we're getting really ready to launch into having to put it all into practice is very valuable.